Well, good evening, all. It's Devora Krasnianski from Adai Ad, and I'm really excited to be working tonight together with Ruchama Clapman from Mask, Simcha Feuerman, and Rivka Krumholz about this very important topic of what is couples counseling. So I want to first introduce Ruchama from Mask. This is her starting her 25th year of the work of Mask, and because of Mask, I believe a lot of the stigma attached to therapy and mental health and addressing mental health has been really, really reduced. So thank you so much on behalf of the whole Klal Ruchama. Thank you for Mask. 25 years is a huge accomplishment. So thank you. And at this point, I want to jump into who are we, Ruchama, you introduce your colleagues and introduce the topic, and then we'll just jump right into the topic. If anyone has any questions, you could send them via the Q&A at the bottom of your screen or wherever it is on your screen, or in the chat if you wanted to keep it private, make sure that it's coming to one of the panelists or to everyone. Or you can also use the anonymous questions. So we'll definitely try to address all the questions that come in that are relevant to most of the group. So thank you all, and Ruchama.
Well, thank you, Devora, for all you do for the Klal. And I'd like to thank both our guests here tonight. First, I'll start with Rivka Krumholz, ladies first. And I'd like to say that it's really an honor to be working with you for so many years, from the beginning, actually, when we met 25 years ago, when I started Mask. And it's really wonderful having you on. Rivka Krumholz is in private practice in marriage and family therapy. She's been working for decades serving the Jewish community to improve mental health and family relationships. She sees individuals, couples, and psychotherapy. And really an honor to have you on with us, Simcha Feuerman. It's been a long time. We've been working together, helping the Klal down, this journey of Mask, all these years working with OHEL, working with Nefesh, and so many individual families that you've helped. Simcha Feuerman specializes in high conflict couples and families and male sexual health. He maintains a practice in Brooklyn, in Queens, and we're welcoming him to Boca Raton, Florida now, every Thursday. So thank you both for being on. I just want to mention what Mask is. For those that don't know, Mask is for helpline, support groups, Zoom, and in person. And we are a referral organization for all mental health, including addiction. And if anybody needs a referral for yourselves or a loved one, feel free to give us a call at Mask 718-758-0400. And we have a radio show every Thursday night on the Zev Brenner 620 AM radio dial and talklinecommunications.com, where I interview therapists and parents for all mental health issues, authors. So I'd like to invite you to listen to that Thursday nights, 9 p.m. It's wonderful being on with you, Devora, and let's get to it. This is such an important topic. And let's start. Devora.
Yes. So couples therapy. So let's talk. What we'll talk about tonight is what is couples therapy, what is it not, what does it look like, to kind of take away some of that mystery that holds people back from seeking the help or working with a couples therapist. So let's just talk a little bit about what are the benefits of couples therapy, or let's talk about what is couples therapy. So Rivka, we'll start with you, and then we'll bounce around between you and Simcha.
Okay, so the question is, what are the benefits of couples therapy, or what is couples therapy? So couples therapy is kind of hard to define specifically. It's a type of psychotherapy. It has many modalities, hundreds, and offsprings of those hundreds. It sort of began in the 1950s as an offshoot of other psychotherapies, which had been around for, 50, 75 years. There are many modalities. So in order to answer the question, like, what is it like to go to couples therapy? It's very difficult to answer because there are successful practitioners with many, many different modalities. And what we do know from some of the evidence, there's not really any excellent evidence about which particular modality is best or not best. There are, specifically practitioners who have successful results or not. One of the things that's important, I think couples therapy does have a little bit of a negative reputation sometimes as not working. So I do hear that from time to time. The evidence that I was able to uncover from a meta-analysis of most of this, 35 studies that were done covering all the major modalities. What it shows is a results of about 18 to 45% what's considered recovered, and 10 to 25% improved. So when you compare that to other treatments for other types of ailments, those are not bad results. It's not 100% of the people who go through couples therapy are saying, wow, that really helps, I'm done. But it's very good results when you compare it to other types of treatments that you wouldn't question twice about having if you had health issues, mental health issues, physical health issues going on in your family. And it's my personal view that there's probably very, very few things in life that are more of a family health issue than the quality of a marriage. It affects generations of physical, mental, spiritual, financial health. So to me, there's just nothing more important to address, and not just save from a disaster, but to continually try to improve.
Okay, so why do so many people actually then delay going to therapy if it's so wonderful for the family? So Rivka, do you want to continue with that, and Simcha, you want to build on that after?
Well, I actually had comments to make on the first question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I agree, obviously, with what Rivka's saying, that there are many, many modalities. But I wanted to talk about like a kind of a frame of reference. I think that a lot of people think of couples therapy as two people in the room getting some kind of therapy, and I do really think it's different. I think conceptually, it's better to see that the relationship is the client instead of the individuals, and that has a very big difference in a lot of ways. For example, as much as possible, I think a good couples therapist is not trying to look so much at the individual pathology of the persons. People come into relationships with different strengths and weaknesses, and that intrinsically, I think couples therapy is strengths-based, which is that you're trying to understand, given whatever individual strengths and weaknesses are, whatever there are, whatever difficulties each person might have, how does that work together? Because oftentimes couples have a way of falling into a pattern where one person's defenses and coping skills completely rub against the others. So, the classic, for example, the very classic chasing and retreating. One person finds safety in connection, another person might find safety in pulling into themselves in isolation. So here you have two people who might function very fine, relatively speaking, on their own, but their coping styles and their defenses could be driving them nuts. Anyway, the point is that there's a tremendous advantage to couples therapy in a sense, and any family therapy, any type of systemic therapy, where you're looking at how people function in a system, because you're really, the tail is, in a certain sense, the tail is wagging the dog. Meaning to say that when someone's in individual therapy, which could be extremely important, even if individual therapy might be a slower process, it's also a bit of an echo chamber because there's no encounter with anybody else. You're not forced to figure out with all that you've got, with your good stuff and your bad stuff, and that's a clinical term, with your good stuff and your bad stuff, how do you work with somebody else? But when you're being guided professionally by somebody who understands systems and relationships, whatever each person brings to the table, there's a real opportunity to figure out how to make it work, aside from the fact that human development classically happens in relationships. That's how we learn how to be who we are, is in relationships. So always a dialogic encounter with another person is extremely valuable to human growth. So to make a long story short, I think couples therapy is a way of learning how to work with others in a very dynamic way. Now, if the therapist is more psychoanalytically oriented, they might look at the way that you're relating and your defenses from that point of view. If they're behavioral oriented, they might think that way. But the point is, it's a dynamic relational process.
Okay. So that's being said, that like we said earlier before, that it's so important for the family for the future. Why do people delay? What is their hesitation about going to therapy? What have you found in your experience?
Are you asking Rivka or myself?
We'll jump with you and then we'll go back to Rivka.
Well, why do people delay going to the dentist? No offense to dentists out there. I think that it's very scary and painful. And most of the time, if you're going to look at emotional difficulties, it's going to get probably worse before it gets better. That's a very, very basic pattern in the universe and in human behavior, that whenever you look at something and you try to make it better, oftentimes it's going to get worse. Even it's a pasuk, me'az basi al paro, hera la'amazev hatzil lo itzaltas amecha, right? It got worse for the Jews once Moshe interfered, because whenever you get into a system and you try to tinker with a system, as bad as the system is, the system works. Zacharnu es hadaga v'sakishuim. We remembered the fish and the cucumbers that we ate in Mitzrayim. You know what they did? They had fish and cucumbers. The minute you bring something in to change something, at first everything gets destabilized, and that's certainly true with any kind of therapy. And people don't, it's very, very difficult. They reach a point where it's so painful that they look at it like, I'd rather go through this pain, or I have nothing to lose because everything's falling apart anyway. Arguably, of course, that's not the best way to do things, just like it's not the best time to look at your teeth when you need root canal. But it is kind of human nature, to put off difficult things like that.
I would also imagine for some people it's a money issue and they'd rather move the money to something else.
Yeah.
There's like this mug that someone sent me. I don't need therapy. I just need to get to Israel. Like that.
Okay.
That kind of idea that there's other ways to deal with this situation rather than getting the real help that would really help the situation.
Well, there most certainly is. By the way, there are a lot of ways people can improve their lives. They don't need therapy to improve their lives. But as Yogi Berra said, wherever you go, that's where you'll be. So
Right.
I don't know if going to Israel is going to solve problems, but it might feel a lot better if you're in Israel.
For that week or two.
Yeah, and I hear Simcha talking about how how the experience might be that there are a lot of ways to improve our lives, and I think that's something really encouraging that I like to tell couples all the time if they're fearful about going into a room with a stranger and the person that you're in conflict with, and with this feeling like they're going to do surgery and open you up against your will. Good therapy should not be exactly like that. It goes through rough patches. It goes through a lot of destabilization that Simcha was talking about in the system, because once a family is like a mobile on a baby's crib, if you gently move one of them, everything reorganizes. And so human change is surprising to people that live in that system. But I think the encouraging thing to look at is that if I am open, if I am looking to change, if I'm looking to learn, I will learn. I will have therapeutic experiences in my life from everything. That's my focus and that's my curiosity. And, one thing you brought up about the money issue, I call it it's a priority issue, because money is a real thing. I'm not downplaying it, but when people decide on their priorities, somehow they come up with the money for things that are really, really important. And the process of therapy, though, it should be leading towards new ideas and bravery at having new conversations with your spouse that you've never had before. And that's not all painful. It's not all looking at the dark underbelly of our lives. It can be a very progressive process also. And you have to be prepared that there are rough patches and experiences and things that you would rather not face. And probably not facing some of those things is how couples get into distress to begin with.
May I comment about the money for a moment? Because I think it's such an important issue, and it's a very real issue. And of course, it is true that it's a matter of priorities. But I think there's another way to think of it too, which is that oftentimes success, I'm talking about financial success or failure in life, depends on split-second decisions. What job you take, or even what groove you're in when you go on that job interview, or if you have to make a risky business decision, and you're an entrepreneur, are you in tune with yourself, hearing the alarm bells or not? And then when people have their relationships in order, when they really have a good balance and they have love and they have support and they have someone who they can rely on and get feedback from, they do better. So like a good relationship, a good marriage, a good family is a kli machzik bracha for sure. And that it's so easy. Look, money is one of those crazy things where it's so easy to make and it's so hard to make at the same time. But the people that are successful financially or in their careers oftentimes have to function at their best. If they're a surgeon, they can't start their day having gotten in a fight with their spouse. If they're an entrepreneur, they can't be having 16 emergency calls from one of their family members that are falling apart. The point is that if you have good relationships, you're positioned to function better and make good choices. And it's easier to save, to not get into problems that cost a lot of money based on poor decisions. And it's also easy to be much more successful. And I really believe that that's true, that people can, whatever they're going to spend on therapy, they can really earn it back in terms of the benefit that it brings them in being leaner in their decision-making, more confident, more clear, less self-destructive, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. The data is very overwhelming about how marital happiness it correlates with wealth and stability. And it's not the outcome of wealth. It's one of these causes that Simcha is talking about. It is probably one of the best investments someone could make to their financial portfolio, because you do have to be at the top of your game in order to make wise decisions. And one of the variables that are isolated in these studies about wealth and marital happiness are the husband and wife being on the same page. And if you can be on the same page about anything, finances or kids or education or lots of things, that's just a portal into being on the same page in your relationship.
Angle. Thank you. So let's talk to the part that people have the impression that they're going to be having to spill out their dirty laundry in front of somebody. So let's talk to where that myth came from, or is there what's the truth in that? What's the experience in the room? Rivka, the camera's on you, so let's start with you, and then we'll bounce to Simcha for.
Well, I think since we're talking about finances, I'll use it as a metaphor. When you go to a financial advisor, you don't go to them and say, "Here is my money. Will you babysit it and make all decisions about my money?" You go there and you look for the person to teach you. What do I need to know? What do I need to know to make wise financial decisions? So if you go to a marriage therapist or an individual therapist, you're asking the same question. I want to know why I'm here. I want to know what you're thinking. I want to know what the rationale is. The therapist is not there to tell you what to do. The therapist is there to help you get to your optimal state of mind to make your own decisions for you. So you should never outsource that. If you are being asked questions that you feel are premature or uncomfortable, you need to speak up. It's your money. It's your therapy session. It's your marriage. And the therapist is not an expert on your marriage. The therapist has eyes to see things that you may not be seeing. So it's very important for you to feel empowered to speak up and be part of that process, and not just a willing partner in doing something that doesn't really make sense to you.
Simcha, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say that I think it's a lot. It has to do with the tone and the mood of the people coming in. Now, of course, you could argue, well, if we got along, we wouldn't be coming to you. But I do really try to encourage people to become scientists about their relationships and to try to work with a collaborative stance. Because if you come in, you can talk about almost anything. And if you talk about it in a non-adversarial way, which is, look, there might be another way of looking at this. This is my experience. This is what goes on. This is how it lands with me when you do this, when you say that. This is what it feels like. And I would like to know, what's going on for you, and for us to figure out what goes on with each other. Now, of course, if they could do that perfectly, they wouldn't need couples therapy. But the point is that you could really try to make it non-adversarial and to make it collaborative. Jung, who I'm very enamored of in many ways, said that the extent to which you will influence others is the extent to which you are open to being influenced. And it's a very powerful statement. So if two people come in, and I try to prep them for it, and this might answer another question too, as to whether or not you see the individual before, after, or during, or you see the couple together. And one of the things I try to help the couple understand is, if you are ready and functional enough to come in and talk about yourself, but also see the other and hear about the other, you don't need to agree, but you need to really be open and interested in understanding the uniqueness of the other person, to see and be seen, to talk and to listen, to listen very loudly, then working together can be a very good idea. And you don't need to necessarily meet with me individually to tell me all the different things. On the other hand, some people do need prep to be ready for that. But the point is that it can be extremely collaborative. You don't need to see everything right away. Of course, ultimately, if something is weighing on somebody, it will oftentimes become a barrier. There's research about that. If most of the time you can't avoid an issue, there is one exception. If you have two completely committed avoiders, and they both are real serious avoiders, where they're perfectly happy to suppress a problem forever and ever. Think of maybe this old time, extremely adel European couple that they never would say a bad word to each other, and they always are judging each other favorably. Theoretically, you can bury stuff under the carpet, but that's for the pros. I mean, 99 out of 100 people, if something bothers them, it's going to come out. Either it's going to come out directly or it's going to come out passive aggressively. And so ultimately, you got to talk everything out anyway. That's the general advice, obviously in the right way, in the right time.
Okay. So what are the typical issues that a therapist can help a couple with? And what are things that they may go individually, that it's better to go for individual?
Me, Rivka?
Well, the screen's on you, so we'll just bounce away in that way.
Okay, I can't tell how it's going.
Okay.
Okay, so basically, typical relationships issues: loneliness, communication, sexual relations, anger, parenting, religion, in-laws. These are the things that people, money, these are the things that people fight about all the time. Oftentimes they're more of a symptom than the actual, problem. But basically, I think in a relationship, you want to feel safe, you want to feel loved, you want to feel supported. And most people know what that feels like. And if you don't have that, to varying degrees, it can become a major satisfaction, and quality of life issue, to say the least.
Mhm. So I think that you were asking about, when is couples therapy contraindicated? What types of issues would not be addressed? Because as Simcha said, anything that they bring in is just a portal into what's going on in their relationship. If there is abuse, if there is intimidation of one party from the other, the potential for punishment, the potential for financial punishment, emotional punishment, the potential to threaten them, different abuse appears in different forms. And at that case, then couples therapy immediately is generally contraindicated. And what needs to happen is one or the other, it really doesn't matter. Either one in the party can reach out for individual help. Once the person who is intimidated becomes intimidation proof, which would be the goal of a therapist in the case of abuse, then there will be potentially a time when couples therapy is just the next segue into changing that pattern.
And what would we do if one spouse doesn't want to go to therapy? Can the marriage be worked on, maybe not through couples therapy, but in some way?
Well, the beautiful thing about relationships is once one person changes in a minor way or a major way, it's a different relationship. So it doesn't matter where the change is introduced into the system, something is changing and something is different. So generally, the healthiest person in the family is the first one to go to therapy. So if the spouse won't go, you make the call anyway.
And would that be going to a couples therapist, even though you're going alone, or a regular therapist, an individual therapist? What kind of therapy would be working in that case?
Well, I think if a person said, I want couples therapy and my spouse won't go, I think the first call would be to the couples therapist and say, what do I do? And different couples therapists have different ways of approaching that.
Simcha?
I would say that when someone doesn't want to go to therapy, there's something being communicated. And because human beings are always communicating, even when, despite themselves, sometimes their communication might be, I want to have nothing to do with you. But it's not always so simple, because there can be feelings of hopelessness, for example. There could be a fear, like Rivka mentioned. There are certain types of relationships that there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of power dynamics. So the weaker spouse may not feel comfortable going to therapy or talking about what's really going on, and many other things. So it needs to be addressed compassionately. But I would say that, yes, if someone wants to go to couples therapy and their other spouse doesn't go, they should contact a good couples therapist about that issue. Oftentimes, I feel that it can be diffused. Usually within a couple of sessions, you try to understand what's the other person really saying by not coming. What's their ask? Everybody has an ask in a relationship, otherwise they wouldn't be in it. Even if the ask was only, just leave me alone, it's never really that simple. And so oftentimes you can do what's called remote control couples therapy. Start at some point trying to address what might shift the system. As Rivka mentioned, systems are very, very sensitive to change. And one person changes something. So you might analyze with the spouse who's coming, different patterns of communication, different defenses, different ways that things start to go wrong, and suggest a way to change that up. And many times that brings enough change that either the relationship improves a bit, or actually the spouse is curious and wants to come. And once in a while, it doesn't work. Like everything, human beings make their choices, and you never can predict what people would do. But it is a good idea, at least to try, even if the other person doesn't want to come.
Okay. So at the very beginning, we talked about different modalities. How does someone know what type of modality would work? Is it, and what are the different types? Can we talk a little bit to that? Simcha, we'll start with you, and then Rivka, you can add to that.
Well, it's funny, when I started doing being a therapist 26 years ago, there weren't so many modalities as there are today. Today, there's so many different names for things. Now, some of those are essentially just taking elements of what would be good old-fashioned therapy and trying to manualize it and operate within a certain context. And others really do represent, I think, solid research and new ideas. For example, I think that Gottman's work and Sue Johnson's work, they're based on a lot of solid research, even though some of the techniques that you use, many therapists who never heard of Gottman might intuitively do some of those very same things, and especially types of therapy that focus on attachment, like EFT. Any decent therapist might be doing that, but it is good to know about the modalities. There's a lot you could look up and learn about, even watch videos about or purchase books. But I would say 50% at least of the therapy has to do with the personality of the therapist. It's at least as much an art as a science, and that when you're going to a therapist, you have to figure out, does it feel right for you? I wouldn't, just because you got a bad feeling one time, I wouldn't leave the therapy automatically, but I would feel free to challenge the therapist with whatever you felt uncomfortable with. Usually that's the greatest indicator. When there's some kind of interruption in the relationship, how that's handled is really the key to everything. In old-fashioned psychoanalytic therapy, the transference is extremely important, but even in the therapies that people do today, those experiences, how you handle and make correction and make repair is indicative of all kinds of relationship skills and all kinds of things can be modeled. So, if you get a bad feeling about the therapist, about something that went on in therapy, you confront it. If it goes well and something new grows from that, that's a big opportunity. And if it doesn't, maybe the person's not the right therapist. That's fine too.
Rivka?
Yeah, so I think it's a very good resource to ask a Rav, to ask some community mentor that you may have, to ask a Chassan Kala teacher, to ask around. You want to know, like, have there been successful experiences with somebody in particular? As Simcha was mentioning, you can do a little reading on different types of modalities and get an idea of, if you feel like one may be, more your speed than another. But there's no shortcut from really using your own wisdom to, call that therapist, ask that therapist questions. I recommend sometimes people make an appointment with your spouse with a couple of different therapists. Go interview them. This is your marriage. Like, why wouldn't you? You're entering into a fairly deep relationship with somebody. You're putting your hands putting your marriage in the hands of a professional. So you want to trust your judgment about that. And the most important thing that Simcha was talking about is you have to bring up what you're uncomfortable with, not be afraid to confront that therapist and work through that.
Well, I think that's another important reason why you would call, let's say, a referral like Mask or Ruchama, because she does know she can understand what the dynamics in your relationship are, and she may be able to guide you more closely to either modality or a personality of the therapist, and you can skip some of that trying different people out by speaking to someone who really knows several therapists.
Yeah, that would be very advantageous.
Okay, but as far as the different types of therapists, like there are some that have more certifications or credentials, or then there's a psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker, LMFT, LCSW. Can we talk a little bit what that all means, or does it not really mean very much in the actual room?
Well, I would just say that, anyone with a number of those credentials could also have been trained deeply and interested in becoming an expert in couples therapy. But not all of those people are specifically trained in couples therapy. I would look for that, regardless of the modality or the credentials. Are you a couples specialist.
Now, I'm with Rivka on that the really couples therapy is a very different kind of thing. And it's really exhilarating and wonderful, both for the therapist and oftentimes for the clients. It's very different than individual therapy. And it's not an individual therapist talking to two people in the room. So it is important, if you want couples therapy, if you're in individual therapy and there's something that you want to help your spouse understand about you, or have your spouse adjunct to the therapy in some way, and there's a lot of value in that, that's fine. But if you want couples therapy, or let's say you're having family issues and you want family therapy, you need to go to somebody who's trained in that, because it makes a very big difference.
And does it make a difference as far as like what the presenting situation, like if there's betrayal and you're trying to keep the relationship together, would you need someone who has experience in couples and betrayal, or is that all one thing?
That's a good question. I think that depends on the therapist, because not all therapists have that experience, and it is a very complex issue to manage the betrayal and the repair afterwards, and what it means to both spouses, what it means to the relationship. Not every therapist who works with couples does, work with recovery from adultery or affairs or addiction. So I think that's a subspecialty. Again, part of its reputation and knowing what people have experience with.
So in other words, you can't just go to a couples therapy. If you have something like betrayal or addictions, you really need to find someone who has a lot of experience in that, and not just I don't want to say just, but not of the couples therapy who just works with relationship issues. There's that whole other element.
Given the longer they're doing it, obviously the more they're going to see of those things and have more experience with it. But it's worth asking straight out, however you first introduce yourself to the therapist. I'm working with a situation of betrayal. I'm working with a situation where there's a spouse who's an addict. Is this something you have experience with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with Simcha that, you just ask them straight out. If you have a particular presenting issue, you can ask them straight out if that's something that they are experienced in, and they should be able to tell you. But there are very experienced couples therapists will have dealt with successfully, hopefully, all of these issues and know which ones they want to help and which ones they want to refer out to subspecialties.
And what's if a spouse has a trauma, whether now or in the past, and they have to deal with it's impacting the marriage? So there's that need for the marriage therapy, but the person also needs to work through whatever that trauma was. Are we talking about two separate therapists, or can it all be done in one? Putting aside that it's going to take time and money, but what's the best way to do that?
I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that. I think that, it's very rare to find someone with seriously impaired relationships who doesn't have some sort of trauma in the background. But I think if a couples therapist might very often may uncover something that gets referred out to another specialist for individual therapy.
And would they keep with the individual therapy and the couples therapy?
Well, I do. Sometimes I work with couples and each one of them has their own individual therapist. And then it's teamwork.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the issue with trauma is that everybody reacts to trauma differently. So you'll have people who've gone through things that objectively are extremely traumatic, but for whatever reason, they have a certain kind of resiliency or a certain kind of way of relating to it that it doesn't necessarily affect them deeply. And you have people that went through relatively mild things objectively, but subjectively, because of whatever their own particular weaknesses were or attachments were, are extremely traumatizing. So there's all kinds of trauma that people experience. But the point is that some traumas can be worked through relationally in this collaborative way within a couple's work or family work. And many of them do require their own individual therapy because there's so much pain and so much fear that has to be worked with and released that it's not realistic that can happen in the context of couples work. A lot of individual diagnoses, that's what I referred back to earlier about the tail wagging the dog. It's almost like you can push people and say, this is what a normal relationship looks like. This is what normal communication skills look like. This is what not being reactive looks like. And sometimes they can really grow through it by knowing that someone's saying this is how it can be done. But some people, despite themselves, they can't control their reactivity, not because they're weak or they're immoral, but they really, really are hurting or have things they just need to work on their own. And that's a good indicator for individual work, whether it's trauma or it's a personality disorder. But there are other people that somehow or another, at first they white knuckle it, but they can somehow or another really grow through the relationship, develop a much greater awareness and empathy and all kinds of beautiful things in their current relationship, through their relationship. It's really, like Rivka said, it's not one size fits all. I think it's a collaborative, open discussion, but it's not unusual for people to be in individual therapy and couples therapy. And if it could be afforded, both time-wise, by the way, it's also a time issue. People are exhausted going to different therapies, but it also can be very rewarding. It really depends on the situation.
And just talking about time-wise, is there also sometimes in some therapies some homework or some work that's done in between or like after the session, you say, go home and try this, or go home and talk about this, or go home and think about this? Is that typical to add, when we're thinking about how much time has to be allotted to this therapy, is there also that time, homework time or conversation time?
Well, I'm not a big homework person, although clients sometimes ask for it. And it's funny because whenever I give homework, about 9 out of 10 times they don't do it anyway. And then it becomes this weird dynamic of you being like the principal, and the teacher, did you do your homework? But when people ask for homework, I usually take the last few minutes to ask them, what are you coming out with? Is there anything that you can see that you would do differently as a result of some of what we looked at? And how would you like to put that to work? I think that's a little less homework feel than homework. But it is true that whether it's conscious or unconscious, whether you're taking some time twice a week to talk about what's going on or something, if you don't work on the relationships outside of the therapy, it's kind of like going to physical therapy and never doing any of the exercises. It's not going to stick that well. But I'm personally not a big believer in formalized homework, although I do encourage couples to think about what they're getting and talk to each other about what they're getting from the work and how to use it.
Rivka, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I am the same answer. I don't give homework, it's just not part of the way that I work with people. I want people kind of working less on their relationship and enjoying it more. So I purposely don't give homework. There are therapists that are very successful, and that's part of their treatment plan. So I think it just would depend on the individual therapist. There's not really an answer to that.
Okay. So another question that came in is, when we're working with a couples therapist, can only one spouse meet with a couple, with a therapist, with or without permission? How does that work? They want to say something, but not in front of the other couple, the other spouse.
Well, again, I think all couples therapists, depending on their training and their experience, they work differently. But when you're trained systemically, you are trained that, you're working with the system. As Simcha says, the couple is the client, the relationship is the client. And you are trained to hold those boundaries where you may have individual sessions with each of the members, depending on the need and in the service of the relationship. There are other types, modalities, individual choices where people don't do that.
So I'm with Rivka. I think that the ideal work is really with the couple, and as much as possible, you encourage people to try to bring things up dynamically as it comes. But people do sometimes, they just have this need to talk privately. Sometimes the need might indeed be a resistance to doing the work, but people also need to be themselves. So if people want to meet with me individually to talk about something, I encourage them, to at least consider whether or not it could be brought up in the session. And if not, obviously though, each spouse needs to know that it's going on. Theoretically, they can tell me something that they don't want the other person knowing yet, but it ultimately, at the very least, there shouldn't be side conversations that the other spouse isn't aware of. That would, I think, be a little bit too far in subverting things. But having conversations, it just might be necessary, even though ideally, it's great to throw everything into the mix and work it through.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yeah,
confusing? So.
I agree with Simcha on that, though, in terms of the work that I do, is if somebody has it in their mind that they very much want to have a private conversation, that could get in the way of the therapeutic process for quite a while if you don't let them get that off their chest. And if you have proper training, you're able to take that and not make it into a secret keeping, process.
If someone has something that, how do I bring this up? I need help to know how to bring it up so I don't say it wrong. You kind of have to do that in private, like something like that, or something to the extent of, how do I say that there was a betrayal, that I betrayed? I don't want to just blurt it out. Like, there's a way to say it, I imagine, that will be less hurtful. So that would be.
I think most any couples therapist would give someone an opportunity for an individual conversation about that. Okay.
I mean, disclosures about affairs and major betrayals, they need to be done in a organized, methodical way. That's not something. I mean, sometimes it doesn't come out that way. Either it gets discovered or somebody does blurt it out, but that's not happening under the therapist's guidance. That just happens, and that's life. And maybe sometimes it's all for the best. But if someone comes to you and says, "Oh, I got some really, deep, dark stuff that I got to eventually share with my spouse," the relationship has to be strong first. A lot of work has to be done to brace the spouse. And there are reasons. You might argue, well, why does anybody ever need to know? Sometimes that's true. But if you're dealing with somebody, let's say, for example, who's suffering from an addiction, whether it's gambling, porn, sex, alcohol, if their spouse is not aware of what's going on, their chances of maintaining sobriety is probably near zero. I don't want to say zero because I'm never going to rule out human behavior. Anybody theoretically can do anything. The soul is completely infinite in its ability. But, statistically speaking, it's very hard to maintain sobriety without the support and the involvement of your spouse, not as an enabler, not as a codependent, but as somebody who knows what's going on with you in your life, that you're accountable in some way. So those things ultimately probably do have to be disclosed, and yet to disclose them at certain times would be extremely destabilizing. So those things are very special circumstances, and they do require methodical, careful work. Of course, sometimes they come out anyway. God has his ways, and that's a whole different story. And then you deal with it anyhow.
And one thing to add, if I could just add to that, I think it's important for people to realize that addictions are not contraindicated in couples therapy. Couples therapy can be a very, very important part of people's recovery. Unlike the abuse and manipulation and intimidation situations that I was talking about earlier, addiction does not mean that couples therapy can't be a very important part of that.
Imagine. Does the gender of the therapist matter? Or or a similar question, if one spouse is more resistant, should the gender of the therapist be included in if the husband doesn't want to go, would it be better to go to a male therapist, female therapist, or it doesn't matter? Or the other way around?
I think that people have enough wisdom to follow their intuition on that. And if one person has a very strong preference over the other, why not respect it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question about it, even though you really can't calculate it in advance, but just like personalities have enormous impact on how therapy is done, I'm sure gender does too. Although again, there are men with, many feminine traits and women with many masculine traits. So it also, again, depends on the therapist. But, people have a right to ask for what they want. And I see no harm in that. And I certainly can understand it. I can understand someone saying, you know, I want to, my husband's only going to listen to a man, or I could also understand someone saying my husband's only going to listen to a woman. Frankly, like I could see both.
So I guess what I'm hearing is that it's have a conversation about what kind of therapist you think might work best, and then get, you know, from within the recommendations, and just listen. And that's part one of listening to each other.
Yeah, but I wouldn't over signify it.
Okay.
Just like I know that, you know, people wonder about the religion of the therapist. It is something to consider. Yeah, I mean, it is something to consider. But at the same time, you can't over signify things, because in the end, people are people, and the individual therapist and the mix of who these two individuals are in the couple is probably much more important than a lot of other factors.
As a firm therapist, do you sometimes work in conjunction with the Rav?
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Simcha.
Go ahead.
Okay. Very often, yes.
Yeah, I think Rabbanim are great adjuncts to the therapy process. A lot of times, you know, therapists, we're not as generous with our time, sadly, as Rabbanim are, and rebetzins and college teachers, and so they can be instrumental in holding the couple. Sometimes they're starting to give up. They're getting frustrated. They don't understand the purpose. They don't get the sense of the process. And you know how therapy works. You come in and you talk about it, and that's very valuable in its own way. It really is. But it's great to have adjuncts that support the process. And there are Rabbanim and college teachers who do just such a wonderful job helping, and sometimes even like almost diffusing issues that come up, because the couple, they might not even know what therapy is. You know, we think people know what therapy is, but until you've been in it, you don't really know what it is. So you have all kinds of ideas of what it's supposed to be like. And you think, well, you know, she was supposed to tell him that he's wrong, you know, and a good rabbi and rebbetzin who does referrals, they understand that process a little bit differently. They can explain that more.
And as far as halacha or hashkafa also, as opposed to only being the support, do you work like when someone has like questions about the model or what I should be saying, not saying, and have you spoken with someone's Rav in that way?
I give people, the example I give people is, you know, my pediatrician, he happens to be a frum guy. So if he prescribes me some cough medicine to take on Pesach, I wouldn't assume that if he knows it's chametz, that he wouldn't tell me. But I also don't really expect him to be doing the research for me. I expect him to actually, I'm much happier. I used to have this doctor, I won't even get into it. I'll get into it a little bit. He used to play these Torah tapes in the office. And that's the last thing I wanted to hear when I was in pain was some shiur. I'd much rather him be listening to some medical journal and being a better doctor than listening to a shiur. My point is that getting a little bit lost over there. My point is that where some of us are from, we can't exactly count on us to give you halakhic advice. But on the other hand, we should tell you the best possible treatment that we know of, regardless of what the different questions are that may come up. We might say, hey, you know, some people do have concerns about this. I don't know if you do or you don't. It's completely up to you. But especially when it comes to sex therapy, for example, there are many techniques that some people are not comfortable with. Some Rabbanim will support very much, some Rabbanim won't. And it's, you know, my job as a therapist to tell people what's the best medicine. And then it's up to them to get the answer. I don't mind, you know, collaborating and answering any questions that their Rav might ask to get better clarification on the issue.
Rivka?
You're asking about, I mean, I have never found it to be a particular roadblock in therapy. You know, it's generally a very simple question. If there's some question that comes up, you know, encouraging the couple to have a good open relationship with their Rav and be able to ask questions if that's, you know, if that's what they're doing, that, you know, that's part of the therapeutic process of, you know, in relationships. So I think it just comes up rather organically that they're going to know, and you're going to know exactly what questions need to be asked or not asked. But, having worked across the spectrum of orthodoxy for many decades, I haven't found particular hashkafas to be, any kind of a big problem or roadblock or issue in therapy.
Okay.
Sometimes, just want to add something, sometimes because of the personality of the persons involved, religion can be a fig leaf and a way to cover up certain behavior. So people are very rigid and demanding. I don't like to use diagnoses, so I won't attach the diagnoses, but people are very rigid and demanding and punctilious and rule-oriented. They might throw out aphorisms, from the Gemara, from the teachings. A good husband does, a good wife does. And my rabbi said you have to. And that kind of thing has to be dealt with sensitivity, because really they might not be aware even that their religion is masquerading and covering up personality issues. They might genuinely believe that they're speaking correctly. So, but that's a great example where a good Rav can do something a therapist won't, because I've Rabbanim, from, again, as Rivka mentioned, really all walks of Jewish life, and they'll still call out personality disorders. They'll say, no, that's not menschlich. It doesn't matter what it says, this saying in Chazal, this, that, and the other. What you're doing is not menschlich. That's not normal. That a Rav could say a lot easier than a therapist could say when the person's armed with some particular aphorism and teaching. Of course, it's always the aphorisms and teachings that fit their point of view of the world, and the 100 other statements in Chazal that don't fit their point of view are forgotten about, but that's human nature.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think that what you're talking about, Simcha, is like most therapists will spot that immediately as a relationship issue and sort of having nothing to do with religion. Or to quote my Rabbi Michal Tursky, he says he's been doing couples counseling for over 65 years now, more than that now. He said never once has he ever seen a religious issue in a couple.
See that. As we wind down, how does one determine that the therapy is no longer needed? Is it coming from the couple, from the therapist? And right into that also is how many sessions is, of course there's no exact number, but what should people ask that question? How long is this going to take? How much money is this going to take? So addressing all those points, Rivka?
I think each individual therapist would probably have a different way to address that in terms of when to end therapy, assuming it's been going on longer than the initial number of sessions that were discussed. I think either the couple or the therapist could bring it up very easily. If you've opened up a relationship to bring that up, it will kind of seem obvious. It will get to a point where it just sort of seems obvious, and then you'll discuss it. So it doesn't really matter who brings it up. Most therapists will give you a certain probably number of sessions that maybe they prefer or that they would like to see. I generally say that after 6 to 10 sessions, we'll see if where you're standing and if you feel like you want to continue. What I find is people know if they need to continue or not, usually by after that amount of time. And sometimes things are not so bad. Sometimes big transformation happens quicker than you think.
Simcha?
I'm with Rivka about the amount of sessions. Obviously, there is no set amount. 6 to 12, looking at it retrospectively, analyzing like the data, 6 to 12 is fairly typical, but the range is unbelievable because that's an average. That's not a median number. There are people that I see for 1 or 2 sessions, and really, truly, they get past a certain block, and they're doing much better. And others, because of intrinsic things that are very deep within them, even if the problem might be very clear, the solutions and finding the solutions that work for them and help them change is not. I would just add something that's I think is important to understand about all organisms, whether it's a marriage or it's a flower, which is that everything is self-correcting. It's designed to be self-correcting. When things become not well or things even break, even machinery, it's not because it's broken. It's because the self-correcting mechanism is broken. This is an important distinction. skyscrapers are designed to sway in the wind. When you ride a bicycle, you weave back and forth. You don't stay perfectly straight. And relationships are constantly, and organisms are constantly being exposed to problems, diseases even in our bodies, and the immune system fights it. When we get sick, it's because the corrective mechanism is broken, not us that's broken. So much of therapy is about finding out what's stopping the natural repair. When a doctor sets a broken leg, they didn't actually heal the leg. They're putting the bones together in proximity so that the natural mending occurs. And there's a lot of similar work with things work in patterns in nature throughout. So couples, they have to find, they're not going to solve all their problems in the therapy. What they want to solve is their system of working together. And once they're able to get past certain problems and work together, they can be growing for the next 120 years. I only hope that they are. And they'll be facing many problems together, but their system works. That's the goal, is to make the system work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would like to reiterate what Simcha is saying, is that resilience is inborn in every single person. And I think if your experience, Simcha, is anything like mine, sometimes you're absolutely amazed at the self-correcting mechanism just pops up out of the blue. And people think it's hard and it's toil, but it's already built in and it will correct one way or another. And so if the therapist can sort of fan the flames of that and get out of the way, anything can happen in a short period of time, or some things just do take a longer period of time. But the hope of that happening, is always in my eyes when I meet somebody. I'm like, I know you have the ability to transform yourself into a much healthier person in the blink of an eye. And it happens more frequently than you believe.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Last question that we'll address, and then if you have any final thoughts. I'm married for 13 plus years, or put any number. Is it too late to have a great, happy marriage?
Goodness, she's just getting started. Of course. Of course. Listen, there are things, unfortunately, some patterns, the deeper they get and the deeper the resentment, the harder it is to change. But especially, because of the demographics and the way the population is transforming, I've seen couples that are married, 2 months, and seen couples that are married 35 years. And absolutely, there really is, just like Yesh Kon Olam B'Shah Achas, a person at any moment, if they change something fundamental inside, everything changes. And as Rivka said, that happens. It really does happen. It's amazing. Just as often it may not happen, but it really does happen too. And couples that are together usually are together for a reason. They might claim very superficial reasons, but it's not always so simple. And there's a lot of strength often in these relationships. And absolutely, it's never too late. It's only too late when you decide that you don't want to do that anymore. And that's your choice. That's fine. But if you want to work on it, there's a lot to work on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've worked with couples in their 80s who've been married for 50, 60 years. And it's unbelievable. Their desire just to keep improving is never, ever gone. So 13 years is nothing. Also, it's very interesting if you study happy couples that have been married 40, 50, 60 years, and you interview happy couples, like, what was good, they will tell you, there were periods of time, 5, 6 years. I remember my husband was so depressed he could hardly get out of bed. Or, I remember we had like a whole decade we didn't even talk to each other. And this is the story they will have. And at that point in their marriage, those things have been healed and they have developed a really bonded relationship.
So I think that's
one thing that's very unfortunate.
Go ahead, Simcha. I just like that hopefulness. I want to hold on to that. But go ahead.
Yeah, what's really unfortunate is that the purveyors of popular media, none of these morons have been married or in a lasting relationship for more than 5 years. So even the artwork, it doesn't matter whether it's novels or it's movies or it's plays, they very rarely can capture what real intimacy is like for a couple that's been successfully married for 25, 30, 40, 50 years. And let me tell you, it's powerful what people can achieve. And it is not captured in most, popular art. People don't understand that because the people involved don't even know what they're talking about. They have no way of representing something they've never seen. It's like trying to depict life on Mars. Actually, they're very good at depicting life on Mars. They're not very good. They're good at flying to Mars, but they're not good at going inward. And that's a very sad thing. We're very fortunate, even though we know that there's some marriages that are schlepping along and probably never should have schlepped along that long. We've seen that too. But being part of a traditional community, we can really see the joys of sticking something out, the joys of great-grandchildren, the joys of love and trust that's developed. It's remarkable. It's not for everybody. There are people that they shouldn't have stayed married. That's true too. But by far, it's the other way, that there's tremendous, tremendous benefit to working things out, and so much beauty and so much intimacy in store in very powerful ways.
So I'm glad we're ending on this hopeful note. Thank you both so much. I think that it really uncovered a lot of the questions that came in, really addressed, I think, demystified a lot of what couples therapy is. I think it's worth a try. Figure it out for yourselves, anyone who has any questions. So you can definitely reach out to us at Adai Ad. It's info@adaiad.org, ADAIAD.org, or you can reach out to Mask at maskparents.org. And thank you all. And
718-580400 for a good referral for great therapists like Rivka and Simcha. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you guys for all you do for the cloud.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Good night.
Have a good night.